The afternoon of the St. Mary Mead garden party dawned with that particular golden quality that September sometimes bestows upon England, as if summer were making one last gracious curtsy before retiring for the year. Miss Jane Marple, settling herself on a wrought-iron chair beneath a spreading chestnut tree in the vicarage garden, reflected that such perfect weather always made people behave slightly better than usual, which, in her considerable experience, meant that any deviation from good behaviour would be all the more noticeable. The annual garden party was Mrs. Constance Harrington's particular pride, an event she had organised with military precision for the past 12 years since moving to St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Harrington was the sort of woman who believed that proper organisation could solve most of life's difficulties, and indeed, her garden parties had become legendary throughout the county for their seamless execution. This year's event was particularly special, as she had decided to display her recently inherited tea service, a magnificent set of Davenport porcelain decorated with delicate cornflower sprays that had belonged to her late aunt, Lady Beatrice Eversley. Such a treasure, Mrs. Harrington was explaining to a small cluster of admirers gathered around the tea table. Aunt Beatrice was absolutely devoted to this set. She claimed it was the only china worthy of proper Earl Grey, though between you and me I always suspected she was rather too attached to material possessions. She lifted one of the cups, its cornflower pattern catching the dappled sunlight. Still, one must appreciate craftsmanship when one sees it. Miss Marple observed the scene with the gentle attention she reserved for all human gatherings. She noted how Mrs. Harrington's fingers lingered possessively on the cup's handle. How Doctor. Haydock's medical eye automatically assessed the fragility of the porcelain, and how young Mrs. Blackwood, the newest resident of St. Mary Mead, had gone rather pale at the sight of the tea service. "Are you quite well, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired softly, moving closer to Mrs. Blackwood, who stood slightly apart from the group. Sarah Blackwood startled, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture that seemed both practised and unconscious. "Oh, yes, quite well, thank you. It's just, the tea set is so beautiful. It reminds me of something from my childhood." Her voice carried a faint tremor that had nothing to do with the mild September breeze. The other guests had begun to arrive in the steady stream that marked a successful village gathering. Colonel Melchett, retired and perpetually ruddy-faced, boomed his appreciation for the fine weather while eyeing the refreshment table with obvious anticipation. Miss Weatherby, the village's self-appointed guardian of propriety, made her usual rounds, noting with approval the precise arrangement of the sandwiches and the proper angle of the cake forks. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in purple silk that clashed magnificently with her complexion, held court near the rose bushes, regaling anyone within earshot with tales of her recent trip to Bath. Her companion, the long-suffering Miss Hartnell, nodded at appropriate intervals while keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings, as was her nature. It was Dr. Haydock who first suggested that Mrs. Harrington might wish to actually use the precious tea service rather than merely display it. "Life's too short to keep beautiful things locked away," he observed, echoing a sentiment that Miss Marple had heard expressed many times before, usually by people who had never owned anything particularly beautiful or valuable. Mrs. Harrington's face brightened with pleasure at the suggestion. "What a delightful idea! Yes, I think Aunt Beatrice would have approved. She always said that china was meant to be used, not admired from afar." She began arranging the cups and saucers with ceremonial care, her movements precise and deliberate. Miss Marple watched as the tea service was prepared, noting the small rituals and courtesies that governed such occasions. She observed how Mrs. Harrington insisted on handling the most delicate pieces herself, how Dr. Haydock offered to help carry the heavier items, and how Mrs. Blackwood seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing moment. The actual serving of tea proceeded with the elaborate courtesy that marked all proper English social gatherings. Mrs. Harrington took evident pleasure in using her aunt's precious cups, commenting on their perfect balance and the way the cornflower pattern seemed to dance in the afternoon light. Each guest received their tea with appropriate expressions of admiration for both the beverage and the exquisite china. It was Colonel Melchett who received the honour of the first cup from the prize service, a distinction that Mrs. Harrington bestowed with considerable ceremony. "Earl Grey, Colonel, just as you prefer it," she announced, presenting the delicate cup with its saucer balanced perfectly beneath. The Colonel accepted the offering with his usual hearty enthusiasm, raising the cup in a mock toast. "To beautiful china and even more beautiful hostesses," he declared, bringing the cup to his lips with the confidence of a man who had never encountered anything more dangerous than weak tea in his entire life. The change, when it came, was subtle at first. A slight frown crossed the Colonel's weathered features, as if the tea were not quite what he had expected. He took another sip, larger this time, and his frown deepened. The cup began to tremble in his hands, and a strange, strangled sound escaped his throat. "I say," he began, but the words seemed to catch and twist in his mouth. His face, normally ruddy with good health and fine living, began to take on an alarming pallor. The delicate cup slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the flagstone path, with a sound like a small, sharp scream. Dr. Haydock was beside him in an instant, his social manner replaced by professional concern. But even as he knelt beside the Colonel's now still form, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the scattered fragments of the cornflower cup and to the faint, sweet scent that seemed to linger in the air, a scent that had nothing to do with Earl Grey tea and everything to do with bitter almonds. As the first cries of alarm began to rise from the gathered guests, Miss Marple remained seated beneath the chestnut tree, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm that matched her racing thoughts. The perfect afternoon had been shattered as completely as the precious teacup, and she suspected that before this matter was resolved, more than china would lie in pieces. The garden party, which had begun with such promise and proper English ceremony, had become something else entirely, the opening chapter of what Miss Marple recognised, with the certainty born of long experience with human nature, as a carefully planned murder. The bewildering moments following Colonel Melchert's collapse dissolved into the particular chaos that accompanies unexpected death in polite society. Dr. Haydock, having confirmed what everyone already suspected, arranged matters with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to such grim duties. The ambulance arrived with discretion, and Inspector Slack followed with considerably less of it, his heavy tread and sceptical expression suggesting he regarded the entire affair as an unwelcome interruption to his afternoon. Miss Marple, having carefully gathered the fragments of the shattered teacup into her handkerchief, while others attended to more dramatic concerns, remained quietly observant as the garden emptied. She noted how Mrs. Harrington's hands trembled more when arranging the remaining china than when comforting distressed guests, and how young Mrs. Blackwood had lingered by the gate, casting backward glances not at the scene of tragedy but at the tea-table itself. By evening the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that only genuine shock can achieve. The village telephone exchange, presided over by Miss Robbins with her keen ears and keener memory, became the epicentre of a growing web of speculation and theory. "Heart attack, most likely," declared Mrs. Price Ridley to anyone within earshot, though her tone suggested she found such a mundane explanation deeply unsatisfying. "Though I must say there was something rather odd about the way he fell. So sudden, you know." Miss Weatherby, ever practical, favoured the theory of allergic reaction. "These exotic teas can be treacherous," she pronounced with the authority of someone who had never ventured beyond Earl Grey. "All those foreign additives and essences. I've always said plain English breakfast tea is quite sufficient." But it was the grocer's wife, Mrs. Bantry, who first mentioned the scent that several guests had noticed. Sweet and distinctive, quite unlike anything that belonged in a proper tea service. Dr. Haydock, when pressed, admitted only that the matter required further investigation, a phrase that sent fresh ripples of excitement through the village gossip network. The tea service itself quickly became the focus of intense scrutiny and speculation. Mrs. Harrington, pale but determined to maintain proper standards even in crisis, found herself recounting the history of her inheritance to a steady stream of well-meaning visitors. Aunt Beatrice was devoted to that particular set, she explained to Miss Hartnell, who had arrived with a basket of comfort food and an obvious hunger for details. Davenport porcelain, you know, with those lovely cornflower sprays. She claimed it brought good fortune to important decisions, though I always thought that rather fanciful. The mention of Lady Beatrice Eversley stirred memories throughout the village. She had been a formidable woman, known for her sharp wit and sharper business sense, who had managed her late husband's considerable estate with an iron hand. Her death 6 months prior had occasioned much discussion about the disposition of her property, particularly the speed with which her will had been executed. There was some talk about family disagreements, Miss Hartnell confided to Mrs. Clement over morning tea. Something about a great-niece who felt she had been unfairly passed over. And didn't someone mention a companion who was dismissed rather suddenly? These old families do have their complications. More intriguing still were the whispered stories that began to emerge about Lady Beatrice's entertaining habits. Mrs. Jeffreys, whose second cousin had once worked in the kitchens at Belmerton, recalled tales of elaborate house parties where the hostess had insisted on serving tea personally from her precious cornflower service. There was an incident once, she murmured to her circle of eager listeners. A gentleman visitor, a solicitor, I believe, taken suddenly ill during afternoon tea, put down to bad fish naturally, but there was talk among the staff. Lady Beatrice dismissed half of them afterward and never served shellfish again. Miss Marple, making her customary rounds through the village, absorbed these fragments of gossip with the patient attention she reserved for all human revelations. She noted which stories gained credence and which were quickly dismissed, which villagers seemed genuinely shocked and which appeared to be performing their surprise for an audience. Most interesting was her encounter with Mrs. Blackwood outside the post office. The young woman appeared even more distressed than the previous day, her composure fragile as morning frost. "Such a terrible thing," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about that beautiful cup smashed to pieces. It seemed almost inevitable, somehow." Inevitable? Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her attention sharpened considerably. "Oh, I don't mean—" Mrs. Blackwood caught herself, colour flooding her pale cheeks. "I simply meant that such delicate things are always at risk." Perhaps Mrs. Harrington should have kept the set safely displayed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting the curious fatalism in the young woman's manner. "You mentioned yesterday that the service looked familiar. From magazines, wasn't it?" "Yes," Sarah replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "My grandmother kept scrapbooks of society photographs. She was quite fascinated by such things." As Mrs. Blackwood hurried away, Miss Marple observed the faint dusting of white powder on her gloves, flour perhaps, or icing sugar, or something else entirely. In her considerable experience, the details that everyone chose to overlook often proved the most significant of all. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had begun his investigation with characteristic thoroughness and minimal diplomacy. The remaining tea had been sent for analysis, along with the fragments of the fatal cup and several other pieces from the service. His preliminary interviews had established that the tea service had been locked away until the morning of the party, handled only by Mrs. Harrington herself. "The poison was introduced at the vicarage," he announced to Dr. Haydock with grim satisfaction. "Question is, who had the opportunity and the motive?" Miss Marple, overhearing this pronouncement, reflected that in her experience the most dangerous questions were often the ones nobody thought to ask. As the village settled into an uneasy evening, she sat in her parlour with her knitting, thinking about teacups and human nature, and the curious ways in which the past insisted on intruding upon the present. The bitter almond scent had faded from the air, but its implications lingered like shadows, touching everything with the possibility of deliberate malice. Tomorrow would bring fresh theories and new revelations, but tonight Miss Marple was content to consider the delicate patterns that connected Lady Beatrice's cornflower cups to the complex web of relationships that bound St. Mary Mead together. Patterns that, like her knitting, required patience and careful attention to reveal their true design. The morning following Colonel Melchett's shocking death brought with it the peculiar quality of light that seems to illuminate ordinary things with extraordinary clarity. Miss Marple, rising at her customary hour, found herself drawn to her sitting-room window, where the fragments of the cornflower cup lay wrapped in her handkerchief. She had gathered them the previous evening, while others attended to more dramatic concerns, guided by an instinct honed through decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. Unwrapping the delicate pieces, Miss Marple held the largest fragment to the morning light. The cornflower pattern remained, cheerful despite its tragic associations, the blue petals still dancing across the white porcelain. More significantly, when she warmed the shard gently in her palm, the faintest trace of that distinctive bitter almond scent returned, Not the robust aroma one might expect from the tea itself, but something more subtle and localized, clinging to the porcelain like a guilty secret. This observation, small though it might seem to others, suggested something rather important. The poison had not been introduced into the teapot, where it would have affected everyone who drank. Instead, it had been applied with surgical precision to a single cup, the very cup that tradition and social hierarchy had destined for Colonel Melchett. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Mrs. Harrington hurrying past the window, her usually composed demeanour replaced by an agitation that expressed itself in quick, nervous steps. Most telling were her pristine white gloves, unusual for someone who had spent the previous day managing garden refreshments and comforting distressed guests. Miss Marple decided that a morning visit to return a borrowed lace pattern would not be considered intrusive under the circumstances. Mrs. Harrington received her with the particular gratitude of someone desperate for normal social interaction, ushering her into the morning room, where the empty case for the tea service sat like a shrine to vanished beauty. "The police have taken everything, of course," Mrs. Harrington explained, her eyes lingering on the velvet-lined case with its 36 empty spaces. Such a careful arrangement Aunt Beatrice insisted upon. Each cup had its precise place, and there was a particular order for serving. "How thoughtful of her," Miss Marple observed gently. "I imagine she had specific traditions about which cup to use first." Mrs. Harrington's face brightened slightly at the memory. "Oh, yes, she was quite particular about that. The first cup, the one for the guest of honour, had a tiny flaw in the glaze, just under the cornflower at the base. She called it the kiss, and insisted it brought good fortune for important decisions. Nonsense, perhaps, but she was firm about using it first." Miss Marple's knitting needles seemed to pause of their own accord. "How charming! And I suppose you followed her tradition yesterday?" "Actually, it was Mrs. Blackwood who suggested it," Mrs. Harrington admitted, colouring slightly. "She had called last week. Such a sweet girl, so interested in old porcelain. She noticed the little flaw immediately and asked if I would honour Aunt Beatrice's custom at the party. It seemed appropriate." The significance of this revelation settled over Miss Marple like morning mist. Mrs. Blackwood had not only examined the tea service beforehand, but had specifically ensured that the flawed cup, easily identifiable to someone who knew what to look for, would be served first. Her subsequent visit to the U.M. vicarage, ostensibly to help Mrs. Clement with the washing up, provided additional observations. As they worked together in the comfortable domesticity of soapy water and clean towels, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small silver lemon fork, bearing traces of something that wasn't quite tarnish and wasn't quite food residue. "We had rather a muddle with the lemon yesterday," Mrs. Clement remarked, noticing Miss Marple's examination of the utensil. "The slices kept sliding about dreadfully until Mrs. Blackwood rearranged them so prettily, with little sprigs of mint between." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mint was innocent enough, but it would effectively mask other scents, particularly the telltale bitter almond aroma that might otherwise have warned the Colonel before he took that fatal sip. Her morning's discoveries were confirmed when she encountered Dr. Haydock outside his surgery, his expression bearing the particular strain of a medical man who had spent the night grappling with unpleasant certainties. "The laboratory results are quite definitive," he informed her quietly. "Cyanide, as we suspected. But here's the curious thing, Miss Marple. The teapot itself was completely clean. Whatever killed poor Melchett was introduced through some other means entirely." This confirmation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own observations. The poison had been applied to the cup itself, probably to the rim where lips would naturally touch. Someone with intimate knowledge of the tea service's traditions had ensured that the fatal cup would reach its intended victim through the inexorable machinery of social custom. As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple observed the subtle changes in her neighbours' behaviour that marked a community under stress. Mrs. Blackwood passed on the opposite side of the street, her movements displaying that curious combination of purpose and reluctance that suggested someone carrying a burden they longed to set down. Her gloves, Miss Marple noted, were not quite as pristine as they had been the day before. Inspector Slack, she knew, would be pursuing the obvious avenues, financial motives, family disputes, the conventional territories of murder investigation, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous crimes were often the most personal ones, rooted not in grand passions but in the small, festering resentments that could poison a teacup as surely as any chemical compound. Settling in her parlour with her knitting as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Miss Marple considered the delicate choreography that had led to murder. Someone had known exactly which cup would be served first, had prepared it with lethal precision, and had arranged for all the social mechanisms of a proper garden party to deliver death with the same ceremony as Earl Grey tea. The cornflower pattern had been beautiful, she reflected, clicking her needles in their steady rhythm. But beauty, as she had learned through long experience with human nature, could conceal the most calculated malice. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations as the investigation proceeded, but tonight she was content to consider how perfectly ordinary social customs could be transformed into instruments of murder by someone who understood both chemistry and human psychology with equal, deadly precision. The truth, like her knitting, was beginning to take shape, one careful stitch at a time. The dawn following Miss Marple's quiet observations brought Inspector Slack to the village with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent the night assembling pieces into a satisfyingly complete picture. His arrival at the vicarage shortly after breakfast suggested he had news to share, and the set of his shoulders indicated it was the sort of news that would bring this unpleasant business to a swift conclusion. "Well, now," he announced to the small gathering that had assembled in Mrs. Clement's morning room, herself, Mrs. Harrington, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple, who had arrived with a basket of late roses that provided perfect justification for her presence. "I believe we have our answer to this nasty affair." Mrs. Harrington's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. "You've found who did it?" "Indeed we have." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. "Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, as I suspected from the beginning. The evidence is quite overwhelming once you know where to look." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention sharpened considerably. She had learned long ago that overwhelming evidence often overwhelmed common sense as well. "The motive is clear enough," Slack continued. "Mrs. Blackwood, or Miss Sarah Lyle, as she was known before her marriage, is the daughter of Harold Lyle, who served as bookkeeper for the Eversley Trust. 3 years ago, Lyle was charged with embezzling funds from Lady Beatrice's estate. Colonel Melchett, sitting as magistrate, recommended the maximum sentence. Lyle died in prison within the year. The revelation settled over the room like a cold draught. Mrs. Harrington's face went pale, while Dr. Haydock frowned with the particular concentration he reserved for connecting disparate medical symptoms. "She had opportunity as well," Slack pressed on. "Called on Mrs. Harrington last week, examined the tea service thoroughly, and specifically inquired about the serving customs. She even suggested that the flawed cup, the kiss, as Lady Beatrice called it, should be used first for the guest of honour. And who did she recommend for that honour? Colonel Melchett himself." "But surely," Mrs. Clement interjected gently, "that could be coincidence." "The Colonel was the natural choice for such recognition." "Perhaps, if that were all." Slack's tone suggested he had saved the best for last. "But we've also discovered that Mrs. Blackwood has been acquiring chemicals under various pretenses. The local chemist confirms she purchased bitter almond oil just last month, claiming it was for flavouring homemade sweets, and she's been seen with several advanced chemistry texts." Dr. Haydock stirred uncomfortably. "Inspector, if I may, a person with genuine chemical knowledge would hardly choose cyanide for such a purpose. The bitter almond scent is distinctive, easily detected by anyone with medical training. There are far more subtle poisons available to someone with that level of education." "Ah, but that's the clever bit," Slack replied, warming to his theory. "She used mint sprigs among the lemon slices to mask the scent." Several witnesses confirmed she rearranged the refreshment table just before serving began. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild curiosity. "How interesting. Tell me, Inspector, have you observed Mrs. Blackwood's domestic habits? Her way of handling household tasks?" Slack appeared puzzled by the question. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Miss Marple." "Oh, it's probably nothing," she replied in her most diffident manner. It's just that I noticed yesterday when she was cutting lemons for her own tea that she's quite decidedly left-handed. I wondered if you'd taken that into account when considering how the poison might have been applied to the cup." The inspector's confidence wavered slightly. "Left-handed? I don't see how that's relevant." "Well," Miss Marple continued gently, "a left-handed person applying something to a cup's rim would naturally reach the areas where a right-handed drinker's lips would touch. But Colonel Melchett was notably right-handed. I observed him signing the visitor's book at the church fete last month. His mouth would have contacted quite a different portion of the cup." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with sudden interest. "That's a crucial point, Miss Marple." The poison traces were found primarily on the left side of the rim, which would be consistent with left-handed application, but inconsistent with right-handed consumption causing the fatal dose. Inspector Slack's notebook seemed to grow heavier in his hands. "These are technical details. The case against Mrs. Blackwood remains strong." "Oh, I'm sure you're quite right," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though I did wonder about one other small thing. When I visited her cottage yesterday, I noticed she had flour on her gloves. She'd been baking, you see. But the curious thing was, the flour seemed to have a slightly greyish tinge, rather like the residue one gets from certain cleaning powders. I thought it odd for someone who'd been working with pastry." The room fell silent except for the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's needles. Mrs. Harrington's face had grown increasingly troubled, while Dr. Haydock wore the expression of a man reconsidering a diagnosis. "The village seems quite satisfied with the solution," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Mrs. Price Ridley was telling everyone at the post office that justice would be served, and Miss Weatherby mentioned something about these new people always bringing trouble. It's curious how quickly a community can settle on an explanation when it fits their expectations." Inspector Slack gathered his papers with less enthusiasm than he'd displayed upon arrival. "Nevertheless, the evidence points clearly to Mrs. Blackwood. We'll be bringing her in for questioning this afternoon." After the inspector's departure, the remaining group sat in thoughtful silence. It was Dr. Haydock who finally spoke, voicing what they were all beginning to suspect. "The case against her is certainly convenient," he said slowly. "Perhaps too convenient. A real poisoner would have been more careful about the technical details. The handedness issue Miss Marple raised, the choice of poison, the public nature of the crime." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, Doctor, genuine guilt rarely arranges itself so neatly for official consumption. It tends to be rather more untidy in its manifestations." As the morning progressed and news of the impending arrest spread through St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while Inspector Slack might have found his convenient suspect, the real murderer remained at large, someone clever enough to construct a web of evidence that would ensnare an innocent woman, while leaving themselves safely hidden in the shadows of village respectability. The truth, she reflected, was rarely as obliging as Inspector Slack preferred it to be. The afternoon of Mrs. Blackwood's expected arrest found Miss Marple in her parlour, her knitting needles moving in their customary rhythm, while her mind dwelt on the small inconsistencies that had begun to accumulate like autumn leaves around Inspector Slack's tidy conclusion. The case against Sarah Blackwood possessed the satisfying completeness that appealed to those who preferred certainty to truth. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to distrust such pleasing arrangements. Her contemplations centred on a detail so minute that even Dr. Haydock had overlooked it, the matter of the spoons. At Mrs. Harrington's previous teas, which Miss Marple had attended with the dutiful regularity of village life, the spoons were invariably placed behind each cup with military precision, handles aligned at 12 o'clock to prevent drips and maintain tidy saucers. Yet, at the fatal garden party, Miss Marple distinctly recalled the metallic chime of Colonel Melchett's spoon, sliding from 3 o'clock position as he lifted his cup, a small discord in what should have been perfect harmony. If Mrs. Harrington had not arranged the spoons in her customary manner, then someone else had prepared the tea service for serving. This seemingly trivial deviation suggested a level of manipulation that went far beyond the crude poisoning Inspector Slack envisioned. Her reflection was interrupted by Mrs. Harrington herself, appearing at the garden gate with the particular agitation of someone whose ordered world had been thoroughly disrupted. The usually immaculate woman showed signs of strain, a loose thread on her sleeve, trembling hands as she struggled with the latch. "Miss Marple, I simply had to speak with someone," she began without preamble, settling herself on the garden bench with visible relief. "This business with Mrs. Blackwood, I can't help feeling there's been some terrible mistake." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with gentle attention. "What troubles you, my dear?" The inspector seemed so certain, but I keep thinking about that morning when Sarah called to see the tea service. She was genuinely knowledgeable about porcelain, spent nearly an hour discussing the different patterns and their histories. Mrs. Harrington's voice carried the particular strain of someone forced to question their own perceptions. But here's what disturbs me. When I mentioned Aunt Beatrice's custom about the flawed cup bringing good fortune, Sarah seemed almost uncomfortable. She kept asking if I was quite certain about the tradition, even suggested that such valuable pieces should remain safely in their case. Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably. A person planning to poison a specific cup would hardly attempt to dissuade the hostess from using it. How did she handle the service during her visit? Oh, she was perfectly proper, supporting the base, never gripping by the handle alone. She even brought her own polishing cloth, said it was specially treated for delicate porcelain. Mrs. Harrington paused, realization dawning across her features. She cleaned every piece with equal care, Miss Marple. If she had intended harm to a particular cup, surely she would have focused her attention there. Through the garden hedge, they could observe Inspector Slack approaching the Blackwood cottage with 2 constables, their official purpose evident in their formal bearing. Mrs. Blackwood emerged with quiet dignity, carrying a small valise that appeared to have been packed well in advance. Not the hasty preparation of someone fleeing justice, but the careful arrangement of someone who had been expecting this moment. "She knew this would happen," Miss Marple murmured, noting the woman's composed resignation rather than the desperate panic one might expect from genuine guilt. As the police car disappeared around the bend, Miss Marple found herself considering the most troubling inconsistency of all. Mrs. Harrington had described her aunt's precise system for the tea service. Each cup had its designated place, with the flawed kiss cup occupying a specific position that allowed it to be served first without examination. Lady Beatrice's flaw was underneath the cup, invisible when properly set on its saucer. Yet for this system to work, the cups had to remain in their exact positions from storage to serving. Any rearrangement would destroy the careful order that made identification possible. Miss Marple recalled that brief moment when Mrs. Blackwood had adjusted the lemon slices, adding decorative mint sprigs, a charming gesture that had drawn everyone's attention, including Mrs. Harrington's. In that instant of distraction, someone with intimate knowledge of the service's arrangement could have acted. Not Mrs. Blackwood, whose helpful gesture had provided the perfect cover, but someone else entirely, someone who understood both the technical requirements of poisoning and the social dynamics that would ensure suspicion fell elsewhere. The real murderer, Miss Marple reflected, as evening shadows lengthened across her garden, possessed a sophistication that went far beyond crude revenge. They had orchestrated not merely a death, but an entire deception, manipulating evidence and expectations with the skill of a master puppeteer. The truth lay not in Inspector Slack's convenient narrative, but in the small violations of custom and courtesy that revealed a mind capable of turning English tea service into an instrument of perfectly calculated murder. Tomorrow would bring fresh opportunities to test her growing certainty about who had truly killed Colonel Melchett, and why. The morning following Mrs. Blackwood's arrest brought an unsettled quality to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed that justice had taken an imperfect turn. Miss Marple, making her customary rounds with heightened attention to the subtle currents of village life, found herself drawn first to the post office, where Miss Robbins presided over both official correspondence and unofficial intelligence with equal dedication. "Terrible business about poor Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Robbins confided, accepting Miss Marple's offering of rock cakes with professional discretion. "Though I must say there were curious patterns in the post if one knew how to observe them." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, recognizing the particular tone that preceded valuable revelations. Patterns? Well, for instance, Colonel Melchett's line was quite busy the week before the party. Several long-distance calls to London, including one to Penrith and Wells, the same solicitors Lady Beatrice used. Miss Robbins leaned closer conspiratorially. And Mrs. Harrington rang a porcelain dealer the very day after the tragedy, asking about valuations and reproductions. Purely informational, she claimed. More intriguing still was the intelligence about Mrs. Harrington's recent correspondence. Legal documents, by the look of them, Miss Robbins continued, and not the routine sort one expects from estate matters. Several bore the stamp of Whitfield and Associates, the very firm that prosecuted that unfortunate bookkeeper fellow, Mrs. Blackwood's father. This revelation cast the neat narrative of revenge in an entirely different light. If Mrs. Harrington had been in communication with her victim's prosecutors, the dynamics of the case became considerably more complex. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to Mrs. Price Ridley provided additional illumination about Colonel Melchert's character. The usually theatrical woman seemed subdued, her sharp edges softened by something approaching unease. "One can't deny the evidence against Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Price Ridley began, "but it does bring back memories of that dreadful Eversley Trust business." Colonel Melchert was quite ruthless in his judgment, said swift justice was essential to deter others. Her gaze drifted toward a portrait of her late husband. "My husband always said Melchert was too quick to judge, too eager to see others suffer for their mistakes. He had a way of making people feel diminished." This assessment was echoed by Miss Weatherby at the village shop, who whispered nervously about the Colonel's tendency to interfere in people's lives. "There was that matter with young Timothy Finch and his inheritance," she confided. "The Colonel refused him permission to sell land when he desperately needed money for his mother's medical bills. Said it wasn't in the spirit of the trust, such rigid adherence to rules regardless of human cost. The picture emerging was of a man whose sense of justice often translated into cruelty, who accumulated quiet enemies through his inflexible moral certainty. Colonel Melchert had been less the pillar of community virtue, and more a figure who enjoyed wielding authority over others' misfortunes. At the lending library, Mrs. Bantry's observations about borrowing patterns proved particularly revealing. "Mrs. Blackwood's been reading everything we have on criminal appeals and wrongful conviction cases," she noted. "Not the behaviour of someone planning murder, I'd say, but of someone seeking to understand how justice had gone wrong." More significantly, Mrs. Harrington's reading habits told a different story entirely. Very practical books, estate management, investment strategies, though she did borrow something unusual last month, the complete guide to household poisons and their antidotes. Said she was concerned about garden chemicals around her nephew's children. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Harrington had no nephew, a fact well established through years of village conversation about her solitary state. The fabrication suggested preparation far more sinister than household safety. Dr. Haydock, encountered outside his surgery, provided the technical insight that tied these revelations together. "I've been troubled by the precision of the dosage," he confided. "Cyanide is notoriously difficult to calibrate. Too little, and the victim recovers. Too much, and death occurs so rapidly the poison could be detected immediately. But Colonel Melchert's dose was perfectly calculated. Lethal, but delayed enough to avoid immediate detection." "Someone with medical knowledge?" Miss Marple inquired. "Or access to comprehensive reference materials, Doctor," Haydock replied grimly. "The sort of precise information one might find in a guide to household poisons, for instance." The afternoon brought news from Miss Weatherby about a curious encounter at the railway station 3 days before the garden party. Mrs. Harrington speaking urgently with an unknown man while carrying a small package, her usual forthright manner replaced by furtive secrecy when observed. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the web of deception that was slowly revealing itself. Mrs. Harrington's inheritance from Lady Beatrice had perhaps not been as secure as it appeared. The speed of the will's execution, the dismissal of long-time staff, the careful cultivation of charitable reputation, all suggested a woman capable of considerable calculation. Most disturbing was the growing evidence that Mrs. Harrington had been orchestrating events long before the garden party. Her encouragement of Mrs. Blackwood's interest in the tea service, her establishment of the young woman's presence at crucial moments, even her apparent reluctance to use the precious cups, all could be interpreted as the methodical preparation of a scapegoat. The village had been presented with a convenient narrative of revenge that satisfied their expectations, while concealing a far more complex truth. Colonel Melchert's death was not the simple act of retribution, it appeared, but the desperate gambit of someone whose secrets he had threatened to expose, someone who understood that his rigid sense of justice would ultimately prove her undoing unless he were silenced first. Miss Marple sat in her parlour as darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking in their steady rhythm, while she contemplated how thoroughly one person had manipulated an entire community's perceptions. The real murderer moved freely among them, protected by respectability and a carefully constructed narrative of innocence, while an innocent woman sat in custody for crimes she had never committed. The truth, as Miss Marple had long suspected, lay not in obvious explanations, but in the small inconsistencies that revealed how completely human nature could be bent to serve the purposes of calculated malice. The morning that followed Miss Marple's disturbing discoveries about village secrets dawned with deceptive tranquillity, the sort of peaceful facade that St. Mary Mead had perfected over generations of concealing uncomfortable truths beneath polite surfaces. Miss Marple, attending to her correspondence with her usual methodical care, was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path, and Mrs. Harrington's voice calling with uncharacteristic urgency, "Miss Marple, thank goodness you're at home. Something terrible has happened to Mrs. Jenkins. She's collapsed at my cottage, and Dr. Haydock says—" Her voice broke, the composed mask she had maintained since Colonel Melchett's death finally cracking under the strain of fresh tragedy. Miss Marple gathered her shawl and followed Mrs. Harrington through the village streets, noting how the woman's usually precise steps had become erratic, how her gloved hands trembled as she gestured toward her cottage. The scene that greeted them there was grimly familiar. Dr. Haydock kneeling beside the still form of Mrs. Jenkins, the faithful cleaning woman who had tended Mrs. Harrington's household with devoted efficiency for nearly a decade. The bitter almond scent that had marked Colonel Melchett's death hung faintly in the morning air, and scattered beside Mrs. Jenkins' outstretched hand lay the fragments of what had once been a delicate teacup, not from the cornflower service, which remained in police custody, but from Mrs. Harrington's everyday spode collection. "Cyanide again, Doctor," Haydock confirmed quietly, his medical certainty cutting through the morning's horror. Applied to the cup rim with the same precision as before, Mrs. Jenkins never had a chance. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the broken porcelain, her experienced eye taking in details that spoke volumes about the killer's desperation. This had not been planned with the meticulous care that had characterized Colonel Melchett's murder. The choice of victim, the hasty preparation, the risk of discovery, all suggested someone acting under pressure, eliminating a threat that had become too dangerous to ignore. "Mrs. Harrington," she inquired gently, "what was Mrs. Jenkins doing when this occurred?" "Her usual morning routine, dusting the display cases, preparing my morning tea." Mrs. Harrington's voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose world had shifted irrevocably. "She mentioned something about the spacing in the cornflower service case looking different. Said she'd been meaning to speak with me about some irregularities she'd noticed." The significance of this observation was not lost on Miss Marple. Mrs. Jenkins, with the keen eye of someone responsible for maintaining perfect domestic order, had been documenting patterns that others had missed, evidence of the tea service having been disturbed before the garden party, not merely on the day itself. Inspector Slack's arrival brought official bewilderment rather than clarity. His confidence in having solved the Melchett case crumbled as he confronted the impossibility of Mrs. Blackwood's involvement from her prison cell. The discovery of Mrs. Jenkins' small notebook in her handbag provided the final piece of this deadly puzzle, careful entries documenting household irregularities that would have seemed trivial to anyone else. Tuesday, polish moved from usual shelf. Wednesday, tea case unlocked when should be secured. Thursday, strange sweet smell in morning room like bitter medicine, Miss Marple read aloud from the neat domestic script. She had been watching, noting changes in routine that suggested someone had been preparing for murder with methodical care. Dr. Haydock's technical analysis confirmed what they all suspected. The poison application is identical to the Melchett case. Precise dosage, careful placement. This isn't coincidence, but the same hand acting twice, eliminating a witness who had seen too much. The realization that Mrs. Jenkins had died because of her careful observations sent a chill through the assembled group. The killer had anticipated that their deception might not withstand close scrutiny, and had prepared to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their carefully constructed narrative. Inspector Slack's renewed investigation took on a different character entirely. "We'll have to release Mrs. Blackwood immediately," he admitted, with visible reluctance. "This proves beyond doubt that our suspect was wrong." Miss Marple observed the proceedings with growing certainty about the psychological profile emerging from these calculated murders. The killer was not driven by passion, but by preservation. Someone protecting themselves from exposure by eliminating obstacles with the same clinical precision they had applied to the teacups themselves. As news of the second death spread through St. Mary Mead, the village's comfortable assumptions about safety and respectability crumbled. The killer walked among them still, protected by social standing and misdirection, while innocent people paid the price for their calculated malice. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting, she reflected on how completely one person had manipulated an entire community's perceptions. The murders revealed a mind that saw human beings as problems to be solved rather than lives to be valued. Colonel Melchett eliminated because his rigid justice threatened exposure. Mrs. Jenkins silenced because her careful observations had noticed patterns that could unravel a perfect deception. The pattern was becoming clear now, like her knitting revealing its design through patient attention to each careful stitch. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would finally expose the truth behind the teacup that had killed twice. But tonight she was content to consider how the killer's very desperation had provided the clues needed to ensure their downfall. The cornflower pattern had been beautiful, she reflected, but beauty could conceal the most calculated malice when wielded by someone who understood both chemistry and human psychology with equal, deadly precision. The morning following Mrs. Jenkins' tragic death brought with it the peculiar clarity that sometimes emerges from chaos. Miss Marple, rising at her customary hour, found herself possessed of that quiet certainty that comes when scattered pieces finally align into a comprehensible pattern. The killer's desperation had revealed them more clearly than any amount of methodical detection might have accomplished, but proving guilt would require the sort of delicate psychological pressure that Miss Marple had perfected through decades of observing human nature under stress. Her opportunity came when she invited several key figures for afternoon tea in her modest parlour, a gathering that appeared perfectly innocent, but was designed with the precision of a scientific experiment. Dr. Haydock arrived first, carrying the weight of professional concern and growing suspicion. Mrs. Harrington followed, her usual composure showing hairline cracks like fine porcelain under stress. Mrs. Clement came with her characteristic desire to comfort everyone, while Sarah Blackwood, recently released and still bearing the pallor of wrongful imprisonment, completed the small assembly. Miss Marple served tea from her everyday rose-sprigged cups, noting with keen attention how each guest handled the delicate ritual. She had arranged the spoons with deliberate precision, some behind the cups at 12 o'clock, others positioned to the side at 3 o'clock, creating a subtle test of habitual behaviour that would reveal more than any direct questioning. "Such a relief to have you back among us, my dear," Miss Marple murmured to Sarah, observing how the young woman naturally reached for her cup with her left hand before compensating with both hands, the unconscious adaptation of someone accustomed to navigating a right-handed world. Mrs. Harrington, however, displayed a different pattern entirely. Her gloved fingers moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting her spoon from behind the cup to the side with automatic precision, positioning it at exactly 3 o'clock before lifting the cup to her lips. The gesture was so natural, so ingrained, that she seemed unaware of performing it. "I've been thinking about dear Mrs. Jenkins," Miss Marple continued conversationally, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. Such a careful woman, so observant about household details. Her notebook revealed such interesting patterns, moved polish, unlocked cases, unusual scents in the morning room. Mrs. Harrington's cup trembled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "Poor woman was perhaps too observant for her own good," she replied, attempting lightness, but achieving only tension. "Indeed?" She noted a sweet medicinal smell, rather like bitter almonds. Most distinctive. Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her eyes watched Mrs. Harrington's face with the attention of a naturalist observing a rare specimen. I understand you've been reading about household poisons recently? Such a practical precaution for someone managing valuable antiques. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Harrington's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her breathing becoming shallow as the implications of Miss Marple's gentle observations settled over her like a net. Dr. Haydock mentioned something fascinating about the poison application, Miss Marple continued, addressing the doctor with apparent casualness. The precision required, the knowledge of how people handle teacups, someone would need to understand exactly where a right-handed person's lips would touch the rim. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. The positioning was surgical in its accuracy. Applied to the left side of the rim, precisely where Colonel Melchert's mouth would naturally contact the porcelain, it suggests someone who had studied the mechanics quite carefully. Miss Marple lifted her own cup, demonstrating unconsciously. Curious how our habits betray us. A left-handed person applying something to a cup's rim would naturally reach the very spot where a right-handed drinker would sip. But, Mrs. Harrington, I notice you position your spoon to the side before drinking. Quite distinctive. Lady Beatrice taught you that custom, didn't she? The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Mrs. Harrington's face had gone pale, then flushed with the particular colour of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. I've had such interesting conversations this week, Miss Marple continued, with devastating gentleness. The porcelain dealer confirmed your inquiries about reproductions and valuations. The solicitors mentioned Colonel Melchert's investigation into irregularities in Lady Beatrice's estate. Even the chemist recalled your purchase of bitter almond oil, ostensibly for confectionery. Mrs. Harrington set down her cup with a sharp clink that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Her composure had abandoned her entirely, leaving behind a woman whose desperation had finally found its voice. He was going to destroy everything, she whispered, her words carrying decades of suppressed resentment. Colonel Melchert, with his rigid sense of justice, his certainty that everyone should suffer for their mistakes. He would have exposed the irregularities in Aunt Beatrice's will, the missing items, the forged documents I needed to secure my inheritance. The confession poured forth with the particular relief of someone who had carried unbearable secrets too long. Years of psychological manipulation at Lady Beatrice's hands, of being forced to dance to an elderly woman's cruel whims, of watching her promise security while threatening to withdraw it at the slightest provocation. Mrs. Jenkins saw too much, understood too much about the preparations. Her careful observations would have revealed how the tea service had been manipulated before the party, how the cups had been rearranged to ensure the flawed piece reached its intended victim. Mrs. Harrington's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long against inevitable exposure. Miss Marple listened with the patient attention she reserved for all human confessions, understanding that truth, once released, must be allowed to flow completely before justice could be served. The teacup had indeed killed twice, but the real poison had been years of accumulated desperation and the terrible lengths to which people would go to preserve the illusion of respectability. As Inspector Slack arrived to complete the formalities, Miss Marple reflected that human nature, like her knitting, revealed its true pattern only through careful attention to each individual stitch, even the ones that seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface. Inspector Slack's arrival brought the weight of official procedure to Miss Marple's parlour, his notebook at the ready, as Mrs. Harrington's confession settled over the assembled group like morning frost. Yet even as the formalities began, there remained an expectancy in the room, the particular quiet that preceded Miss Marple's gentle unravelling of human complexity into comprehensible truth. "I think it would be helpful," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting with deliberate care, "if I explained how these tragic events revealed themselves. Not for curiosity's sake, you understand, but because understanding the pattern helps us recognize such dangers in future." She lifted the largest fragment of the cornflower cup, holding it to catch the afternoon light. The first indication came from this poor broken thing itself. When warmed by the hand, it releases the faintest trace of bitter almond, not the robust scent one might expect from tea, but something localized, clinging to the porcelain like a guilty secret. This told me the poison had been applied to the cup's rim, not introduced into the teapot, where it would have affected everyone. Mrs. Harrington sat rigid, her composure brittle as the shattered porcelain, while Sarah Blackwood watched with the dawning relief of someone finally seeing truth emerge from nightmare. The precision of the application was remarkable, Miss Marple continued. Dr. Haydock confirmed the poison was concentrated on the left side of the rim, exactly where Colonel Melchett's lips would naturally touch. This wasn't accident, but the result of careful study. Someone had observed his drinking habits at countless social gatherings, noting how he held his cup, where his mouth contacted the rim, even his preference for substantial sips rather than delicate tastes. She demonstrated with her own cup, her movements unconsciously precise. Mrs. Harrington, your habit of positioning spoons at 3 o'clock before drinking, learned from Lady Beatrice, meant you understood exactly how the Colonel would rotate his cup when the spoon's placement guided his grip. The metallic chime I heard as his spoon slid was the sound of your calculation working perfectly. Inspector Slack leaned forward. But the evidence against Mrs. Blackwood seemed so clear. Because it was arranged to appear so, Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Harrington cultivated Sarah's interest in the tea service, encouraged her visits, even suggested she might enjoy helping with party preparations. Every kindness was calculated to establish presence and opportunity, while creating the narrative of revenge that would satisfy official investigation. The psychological portrait that emerged was of a woman trapped by her aunt's legacy of manipulation. Lady Beatrice Eversley, despite her charitable reputation, had been cruel and controlling, delighting in keeping her heir dependent through elaborate financial deceptions that Mrs. Harrington had inherited along with the estate. Colonel Melchett's investigation threatened to expose irregularities going back years, Miss Marple explained. Forged documents, missing pieces sold to cover debts, reproductions substituted for authentic Davenport porcelain. Mrs. Harrington hadn't inherited wealth, but the responsibility for concealing her aunt's crimes. She turned to the borrowed household poison guide that had provided the technical knowledge. The choice of cyanide was particularly calculated. Applied in bitter almond oil, it would be masked by Earl Grey's bergamot until the moment of consumption. Someone with access to comprehensive reference materials would know exactly how to calibrate the dosage for delayed but certain death. The manipulation extended to the garden party itself. Mrs. Harrington had arranged for Sarah to adjust the lemon slices and add decorative mint, a helpful gesture that provided perfect cover for the final preparation while establishing the young woman's access to the refreshment table. The mint was especially clever, Miss Marple observed. Its strong scent confused several noses, making people dismiss the bitter almond traces as imagination. But Mrs. Jenkins didn't dismiss them. She wrote them down. The small notebook had documented the systematic preparation, moved polish, unlocked cases, unusual scents. Mrs. Jenkins' careful observations would have revealed how extensively the tea service had been disturbed before the party, contradicting the narrative of spontaneous revenge. Poor Mrs. Jenkins became a victim because her meticulous nature threatened to unravel the deception. Miss Marple continued with genuine sorrow. The second murder was hastily planned, driven by desperation rather than the methodical calculation that characterized Colonel Melchett's death. But it confirmed the same hand, the same method, proving that our convenient suspect was innocent. Mrs. Harrington's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. You don't understand what it was like, living with her expectations, her threats. When she died, I thought the house and everything in it would mean safety, but there were irregularities, gaps I had tried to fill quietly. Then he began investigating, using words like fraud as if they were weapons. Miss Marple nodded with the compassion of someone who had observed human weakness in all its forms. And so you used the very traditions Lady Beatrice had taught you, the very objects of your inheritance, to eliminate the threat. The teacup didn't kill twice, my dear. Desperation did. The rest was simply method. Inspector Slack completed his procedures with unusual gentleness, recognizing tragedy rather than simple criminality. As Mrs. Harrington was led away, she paused beside Miss Marple's chair with something approaching gratitude. "Thank you for understanding that I never meant for it to go so far," she whispered. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "We rarely do, my dear. We rarely do." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of truth finally revealed. The cornflower pattern had been beautiful, but beauty could conceal the most calculated malice when wielded by someone who understood both chemistry and human psychology with equal, deadly precision. The village would heal as villages always did, around the scar, not over it. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but tonight she was content to reflect on how completely human nature revealed itself through patient observation and gentle inquiry. The teacup that killed twice would be remembered not for its delicate beauty, but for the lesson it taught about the dangerous potential that could lurk beneath even the most civilized surfaces. The weeks that followed Mrs. Harrington's quiet departure from St. Mary Mead brought the particular quality of healing that small English villages achieve through the gradual restoration of familiar rhythms. The vicarage garden, scene of such unexpected tragedy, was replanted by willing hands, though no one suggested holding next year's garden party there. Some wounds, even when healed, left permanent marks on the landscape of village life. Sarah Blackwood, freed from suspicion but bearing the invisible scars of wrongful accusation, found herself embraced by neighbours who had initially whispered about her guilt. The village's collective shame at having so readily accepted her culpability translated into determined kindness, invitations to tea, offers of assistance, the small courtesies that constituted St. Mary Mead's version of formal apology. "I've decided to stay," she confided to Miss Marple during one of their afternoon walks. "Despite everything, there's something valuable about a place where truth eventually emerges, where people care enough to feel genuine remorse for their mistakes." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, understanding that Sarah had discovered something important about human nature. Not its perfection, but its capacity for growth and genuine repentance. Inspector Slack, chastened by his near-catastrophic error, had developed a new appreciation for the subtleties Miss Marple navigated with such apparent ease. He occasionally stopped by her cottage for what he termed consultations, accepting tea served in her everyday rose-sprigged cups, with visible relief that they bore no cornflower patterns. "I still don't see how you knew the evidence was too convenient," he admitted during one such visit. "Perhaps that was the problem," Miss Marple replied gently. "In my experience, genuine. Guilt rarely arranges itself so obligingly for official consumption. It tends to be rather more untidy in its manifestations. The cornflower tea service itself had been destroyed by court order, its beauty forever tainted by association with calculated murder. Miss Marple had attended the disposal, watching as each delicate piece was carefully broken. There had been something both sad and necessary about the destruction, beauty sacrificed to ensure that evil could not again hide behind aesthetic perfection. Dr. Haydock, perhaps more than anyone, had been affected by the revelation of how medical knowledge could be perverted for murderous purposes. The precision was almost professional, he reflected to Miss Marple. It makes one wonder how many other deaths might have been attributed to natural causes when they were actually carefully orchestrated. The cottage that had been Mrs. Harrington's domain stood empty now, its windows reflecting the changing seasons with the particular melancholy of abandoned places. Children hurried past on their way to school, and adults found reasons to walk different routes, as if proximity might somehow contaminate them with tragic associations. The village gossips found their usual pronouncements tempered by uncomfortable knowledge that their earlier judgments had been so profoundly wrong. Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby discovered that easy categorizations of good and bad no longer sufficed. The comfortable illusion of St. Mary Mead's impenetrable tranquillity had been shattered, revealing the fragile depths of human desperation that could lurk beneath manicured lawns and polite tea parties. Life gradually resumed its rhythm. Church services, the village shop, the post office handling daily mail. The outward signs of normalcy returned, but the inner landscape had shifted subtly. Neighbours looked at each other with new, unspoken questions. The trust that had once been implicitly granted was now more cautiously offered, tempered by the sobering knowledge that respectability could mask murderous intent. Miss Marple observed these changes with her characteristic blend of detachment and profound understanding. She knew that human nature harboured depths of fear, resentment, and desperate clinging to appearances. Colonel Melchet's rigid justice, Lady Beatrice's manipulative control, and Mrs. Harrington's frantic efforts to preserve her fragile world, all were threads in the complex tapestry of human behaviour, now laid bare. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting, the needles clicking in their steady rhythm. She was working a new pattern, something cheerful and uncomplicated, a deliberate choice after the dark complexities they had all endured. The design grew stitch by careful stitch, reminding her of life itself, full of unexpected twists and hidden knots, but ultimately capable of forming a coherent whole if one had the patience and insight to see it through. The Teacup That Killed Twice had delivered a harsh lesson about the dangerous potential that could lurk beneath civilized surfaces. But in its wake, St. Mary Mead had gained something valuable, a deeper, more nuanced understanding of human nature's capacity for both terrible harm and genuine redemption. The village slept peacefully around her, protected not by innocence, but by the hard-won wisdom that came from confronting evil and emerging, scarred but intact, into the light of truth. Some stories, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction, did end with justice served and peace restored, though the peace was perhaps more complex and therefore more precious than what had come before.